All right, class, we're moving into week 5 here. We're going to get into the life cycle, human body, and some of the things that are centered around ideas like Klein and race. All right, so one of the key components, I would say, currently in anthropology that has been with us probably since the 1920s in Franz Boas's teaching, but also more recently in terms of physical anthropology, is that um, race is not a term that we use, right? Um, the problem with race is that as a term, it denotes a physicality that is also associated with a culture and or intelligence, behavior, those kinds of things. And what we know is that there's no biological determinism. So that race as being a different, a minor part of the difference in biology is not a component that is even utilized in anthropology. And we'll talk about some of those things early on. This is kind of the history of race. People kind of used to consider it a biological adaptation and part of the evolutionary continuum, and we'll see that this is going to be replaced. And like I said, it also had a association with culture and behavior. Um, Also, the fact that human biology and biological variation is driven by evolution, that is, natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, and mutation. And then if we add in mutual aid, then that would be kind of part of that, maybe cultural component. Um, the idea of race is more recent as an invention. Egyptians, Herodotus, and even Marco Polo never mention race. They don't use it as a term to denote different people. They just called people different. Um, uh, Anthropologist Loring Brace believed that race was slowly developed during the Renaissance, and this is also the age of exploration when movement and travel became faster. And what this looks like is, prior to this, people, the way that they moved was usually over land. So what you would see is when you moved across Europe into Asia and or back the other way, Asia into Europe, and then even Europe down into Africa, what you got was gradations of things like skin color, of different appearances. So essentially, as you move into Eastern Europe and further into Eastern Europe, into that edge of Turkestan and um, um, Azerbaijan and some of these other locations, you see a mix of European and Asian traits. So as people traveled that direction, you wouldn't have seen these dramatic changes in human variation. But with the age of exploration, you're now taking ships from, the Netherlands or England, and you're arriving in China or India, right? So again, that becomes kind of this whole other thing in terms of gradations are not there anymore. So you're not able to kind of just connect like the gradual change in humans. So then these people look dramatically different than you do. And this is Loring Brace's idea. And to be honest, it holds up a lot in terms of criticism because the term race is not used prior to that. Soon after the age of exploration is also when we get into a more thorough justification for things like slavery. And this has a lot to do with the idea of ethnocentrism. When people show up to these other locations, remember Europe kind of considered itself civilized. So when it showed up to these places where hunter-gatherers and or tribal groups of people were living the way that they had been living for a very long time, they were judged basically as uncivilized, which then associated, then people put physicality and what they look like, their physical appearance or their phenotype, and they associated that with maybe the behavior and them not being so-called civilized into the same category, which then starts to form these ideas around race. Blumenbach is still, his skull differences, and really they're still used to justify the modern day use of race. Again, this is like mid 70s into the 1800s, mid 1700s, sorry. And it's used to again also associate these people are different. Look, even their skull shape. The problem is that if we hold up a skull of an African American individual or a European individual or an Asian individual, somebody located in there, you would be very hard pressed to tell whether or not what they are. And sometimes some of these individuals' traits are not as extreme, so it's very difficult to tell. But what they did is they picked the most extreme features in Bloom's study, kind of denoting that the structure, right? So some major issues kind of early on, and how the formation of race happens. Boas, Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, really does the I would say the critique and or correction around race. And what he does is he studies immigrant children that basically had been educated, and ultimately the children had changed from their adult parents in terms of physicality, because they moved to America and maybe their diets were different, and also on a similar level of so-called race. So the other thing that they started to look at in this time period were maybe children who were adopted or raised by well-to-do individuals that were educated early on, and it came out that they were just as capable in terms of intelligence. So we debunk race in that because there was an association with your biology limiting your intelligence level, and or your cultural behavior. And this gets debunked when things like adoption and formal education start to add into early childhood. And what he essentially says is that it's all about enculturation, right? It's how we're raised. Essentially, all human beings, no matter what they look like physically, are just as capable of learning and or becoming who they are in their culture and or a different culture, right? So this is a fascinating part. Lewontin basically discovers that so-called race as a phenotype only comprises of 5 to 10% of genetic diversity, and most variation occurs across human populations. What's a fascinating one here is that Lewontin also and some others have recently studied kind of things like genetic drift. So when we look at maybe your great-grandparents and you, there's almost just as much genetic change between your great-grandma and you as there is between kind of this race genetic differences. So it's a fascinating kind of component as well. So, and really what we're talking about with this genetic difference are things like melanin in your skin, maybe shape of physicality, but that is going to have everything to do with Klein. And Klein is a gradual change in some phenotypic characteristic from one population to the next. And this would go back to the ideas when we're talking about people like Marco Polo who are traveling, across Europe into China. So you see the gradations of change in humans, and that would be Klein, and they are all adaptations to their environment and or diet, right? So really what we have is Klein is what we use instead of race, and it is physical differences in humans based on their environment and diet, right? It says nothing else about culture aptitude or intelligence, okay? And then personal genomics is sequencing individual genomes. For this week, there is a human genome video that is very fascinating. It's about the history of kind of the world putting its minds together and creating this, and then what it has given us from that. Things like understanding that Neanderthal is now related to us only happened because we did the Human Genome Project. Life history is something that anthropologists utilize. I would say that this is also associated with the genome projects, Ancestor.com and 23andMe and all these other things are looking at adding in a biological component of who you are. It gets into some identity stuff. I don't know. It kind of depends on people. Again, I was raised kind of being taught that I was, mostly English and German descent. And then my dad did Ancestry and found out that we're actually more like, a quarter or 20% Iberian Peninsula, which is Spanish and Portuguese, which most likely also has Moorish blood in us. So, and then my grandfather did it, and we found out that we had Jewish blood. So I would say it complicates kind of the story that you've been told, but that complication can be cool because it's a lot of our stories of who we are and our ancestry have been based on rumors and or like the game Telephone, where they change over time constantly because people like add in a little bit of a cultural adaptation. So if you're immigrating to a new location, you're going to tell your kids that this is your ancestry so that maybe you don't, you're not persecuted or discriminated against or whatnot. So that becomes somewhat of a washing. But again, this is like a cultural adaptation mode that can be related to genetics. It's quite fascinating. So the main point on this slide is definitely Klein and anthropologists use Klein instead of race, right? So again, race has been debunked. Klein is much more of a biological anthropology term, which is just saying that people look different as they are in different environments, exposed to different levels of radiation, different altitudes, different food products, nutrition. All of those things are part of this Klein structure. All right, so life history and cycle. DNA is the blueprint that schedules growth. So this is a fascinating piece. DNA is not only just like what we're made of, but it also has a time release structure to it. And the environment has a huge impact as well, right? So one of the things about DNA that's a blueprint that schedules growth is a fascinating one. Again, I lived in Korea for 3 years. The older generation in general was very short in stature. And it has a lot to do with the fact that Japan had colonized Korea in the early 1900s all the way up through the mid 1900s and essentially deprived the Korean population of necessary protein. The children of them and even the grandchildren, now that protein is readily available with kind of modern agriculture and whatnot, industrialized farming, the newer or younger generations are much taller. They're 6 feet plus in the male population and taller in females as well. So you look at a whole generation that's very short, and the subsequent generations are taller. What it means is that actually the DNA in even the older Koreans was blueprinted for being tall. But if you don't get the nutrition at the right times of that scheduled growth, it doesn't actually it doesn't complement that DNA side of things. So it essentially just leaves it in this neutral location because you're not feeding that scheduled growth cycle. So there's an intricate balance between nutrition and DNA as well. But again, the example here is that it takes more than just your DNA blueprint. A lot of times it takes a trigger. And this is also true for genetic diseases. I know that in my family, rheumatoid arthritis is something that is passed down. My grandma had it and it was manifested. She said that it was triggered by she stubbed her toe one time really badly, and then rheumatoid arthritis came on suddenly after that. And it was probably much more about like stress in her life at that time. My mom has the trait, but it's never been triggered. So it's kind of a fascinating piece where a lot of these things happen, but they need a trigger to have them come up inside, kind of out, right? Which nutrition does the same kind of thing. And this is where the environment also has a huge impact as well. You may have a genetic trigger for things like, or genetic disposition for things like skin cancer. But if you're never exposed to a lot of sunlight, then you might not ever get it, right? So the environment does have a huge impact. Couple stages here just for you guys to remember. The prenatal stage is conception through birth. Postnatal stage is neonatal or newborn. Infancy, basically second month until the end of lactation, which is weaning. And then we get childhood, 3 to 7, juvenile, 7 to 12, puberty. The change ultimately is after that juvenile structure. And then adolescence is 5 to 10 years after puberty. So again, if puberty hits individuals at 12, then you're really looking at kind of the 17 to 22 age as adolescence. And then you move into adult stage, which is 20 to 50, which is your childbearing years. And then senescence is the after childbearing years. So kind of that post kids zone is seen as kind of past adult stage even. All right, so we will pick up on the postnatal and postnatal aging and environmental stresses. This is a fascinating kind of aspect of things in terms of what is, yes, our DNA is there, but then what is pollution, water pollution, air pollution, soil contamination, chemicals in our food, all of those other things. What is it, how does it manifest, right? The embryo is actually the most sensitive, and that's the first trimester as cells are reproducing. A lot of people think that it doesn't matter in the first 3 months. I don't know why we have this misperception. I know people who have probably still continued their lifestyle to a certain degree during this time period and didn't know, but but essentially might have, if this is the most sensitive time, this is, it's kind of tough. And I don't know that we're, as a culture, having the right conversation